double board certified. 3 groundbreaking surgical techniques bearing her name. The youngest recipient of the Lasker Award for Clinical Medical Research. Dr. Maya Richardson had earned every accolade in her field, but as she walked through the pristine halls of Westlake Memorial Hospital on her first day, none of that mattered to security guard Thomas Jenkins, who saw only one thing: the color of her skin. Dr. Maya Richardson adjusted her navy blue blazer as she stood outside the imposing glass facade of Westlake Memorial Hospital. The morning sun glinted off the building's sleek architecture, casting long shadows across the manicured entrance plaza. At 42, she had just become the youngest chief of surgery in the hospital's storied 125-year history. The board had courted her aggressively for months, flying her in 3 times from Johns Hopkins, where she had built her reputation as one of the nation's most innovative cardiovascular surgeons. "This is it," she whispered to herself, gripping the handle of her leather briefcase a little tighter. Inside was her meticulously prepared presentation for the department meeting scheduled for 9 a.m., her first official act as chief. The presentation outlined her vision for transforming Westlake's already prestigious surgical department into a world-class center for minimally invasive surgical innovation. The board had hired her specifically to elevate the hospital's national ranking, which had slipped from 3rd to 7th over the past 5 years. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. William Chin, the outgoing chief who would be introducing her this morning. Staff assembled in conference room. Some resistance brewing from Matheson's camp. "Nothing you can't handle." Maya sighed, unsurprised. Dr. Robert Matheson, head of cardiothoracic surgery, had been gunning for the chief position himself. At 58, with 20 years at Westlake, he represented the old guard, and had made his disappointment clear during her final interview when the board invited him to participate. She thought briefly of her father, who had worked as a janitor at a small community hospital in Detroit. How many times had he told her, "Maya, you'll have to be twice as good to get half as far?" Even now, with all her accomplishments, his words echoed in her mind. Her parents had sacrificed everything to put her through college, the first in their family to attend. Medical school had been a distant dream funded by scholarships, grants, and endless night shifts as a hospital aide. The complex valve replacement technique she had pioneered, now known as the Richardson procedure, had saved thousands of lives and was taught in medical schools worldwide. Her research on reducing surgical complications in high-risk patients had transformed postoperative care standards across the country. 3 years ago, she had performed the seemingly impossible, saving a patient with a ruptured aortic aneurysm that most surgeons would have declared a lost cause. The video of that surgery had become required viewing for cardiothoracic fellows nationally. Maya checked her watch, 8:30 a.m. She had arrived early intentionally, hoping to walk through the surgical department before the meeting to get a feel for the space that would now be under her leadership. She had been given a temporary ID badge during her last visit, which she now wore clipped to her blazer pocket. The hospital's CEO had mentioned her permanent credentials would be ready later today after completing final paperwork with HR. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the revolving doors and entered the cool, antiseptic atmosphere of Westlake Memorial. Unlike the familiar halls of Johns Hopkins, these corridors were still foreign territory. She approached the information desk to get her bearings, determined to make her way to the surgical wing without looking lost on her first day. After all, first impressions mattered, especially today. Maya thanked the receptionist who had pointed her toward the surgical wing and turned to walk down the east corridor. The hallway was quieter than she expected, most of the hospital staff likely already gathered for the morning meeting. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the polished floor as she studied the unfamiliar surroundings, noting the state-of-the-art equipment visible through half-open doors. The hospital had spared no expense on technology, now they needed the leadership to match it. "Excuse me, ma'am." Maya continued walking, assuming the call was directed at someone else. "Ma'am? You in the blue blazer. Stop right there." She turned to see a stocky security guard with Jenkins embroidered on his uniform striding purposefully toward her. His expression was stern, hand resting near the radio at his belt. "Can I help you?" Maya asked, conscious of the time. She had only 20 minutes before her presentation. The guard, Thomas Jenkins according to his name tag, looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her temporary ID badge. "That's not a current hospital ID," he said flatly. "Where are you heading?" "I'm going to the surgical department," Maya replied, keeping her voice even. "I have a meeting at 9. Jenkins crossed his arms. "And you are?" "Dr. Maya Richardson," she said, extending her hand professionally. He didn't take it. "I don't see any doctor credentials on that badge," Jenkins said, nodding toward her temporary ID. This area is restricted access. Do you have an appointment? Who are you here to see? Maya felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the sensation she'd experienced countless times before in upscale restaurants, exclusive stores and professional conferences. That moment of being seen as an intruder rather than a participant. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that her first day as chief would be free of such encounters. I'm the new chief of surgery, she explained, maintaining her composure. This is a temporary badge until I complete HR paperwork later today. Jenkins' eyebrows rose skeptically. Chief of surgery? At Westlake. The disbelief in his voice was unmistakable. Maya noticed a nurse passing by glanced curiously in their direction before hurrying along. Yes, Maya said firmly. I'm starting today. Dr. Chin is expecting me for the department meeting. Jenkins shook his head slightly. Look, I've worked security at this hospital for 15 years. I know all the department heads. Dr. Matheson is chief of surgery. Dr. Matheson is head of cardiothoracic surgery, Maya corrected him, her patience beginning to fray. Dr. Chin has been chief of surgery but is stepping down. I was hired from Johns Hopkins to replace him. Right, Jenkins said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her. I'm going to need you to come with me to the security office while we sort this out. Maya checked her watch, 8:45 a.m. That's not going to work for me. I have a department meeting to lead in 15 minutes. Please call Dr. Chin or Dr. Harper from administration if you need verification. Ma'am, this isn't a negotiation, Jenkins insisted, taking a step closer. Either you come with me to verify your identity, or I'll have to escort you from the premises. A flush of heat rose from Maya's neck to her face. This was ridiculous. She was standing here in professional attire, with a temporary ID, explaining her position, and this man was treating her like a trespasser. Would he be doing the same if she were a white man in a suit?
I've explained who I am, Maya said, working to keep her voice steady despite the anger and humiliation building inside her. She was acutely aware of being in a public hallway where future colleagues might witness this confrontation. I understand you're doing your job, but I'm telling you I am Dr. Maya Richardson, the new chief of surgery at this hospital. Call administration if you need to verify that. Hospital staff were beginning to filter into the hallway now, some heading toward the conference room where her meeting would take place. A few glanced curiously at the confrontation. Maya recognized two surgeons from her interviews, but they were too far away to notice her predicament. Jenkins' radio crackled. He spoke into it without taking his eyes off Maya. Yeah, I've got an unauthorized visitor in the East Corridor claiming to be a doctor. Says she's the new chief of surgery. The skepticism in his voice was palpable. The radio crackled again. New chief starts today. Bring her to the meeting if that's who she is. Roger that, Jenkins replied. To Maya, he said, I'll escort you to the surgical conference room. If you're who you say you are, there won't be any problem. The fluorescent lights suddenly seemed harsh overhead, the corridor claustrophobic despite its width. Maya felt her heart racing, not from fear, but from the humiliation and indignity of being doubted, questioned, and now escorted like a potential criminal on what should have been a triumphant first day. This is completely unnecessary, Maya said as Jenkins fell into step beside her, close enough that it was clear he was escorting rather than accompanying her. I've been hired by the board of directors after a 6-month search process. Jenkins kept his gaze forward, his expression unmoved. If that's the case, then this will all be cleared up in a minute. But I've never seen you before, and we get people trying to access restricted areas all the time. Do all these people claim to be the chief of surgery? Maya asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. That seems like an oddly specific pretense. A young resident approached from the opposite direction, slowing as he recognized the tension in the scene before him. Maya had met him briefly during her final interview, Dr. Patel, if she remembered correctly. Dr. Richardson, he said hesitantly, glancing between her and the security guard. Maya felt a surge of relief. Dr. Patel, good morning. I'm just heading to the department meeting. The resident nodded, looking confused at the security guard's obvious posture. Everyone's gathering in the main conference room. Dr. Chen was asking if you'd arrived yet. Jenkins' expression flickered briefly, but he maintained his stance. "You know this woman, Doctor?" "Of course," Dr. Patel replied, brow furrowing. "This is Dr. Richardson, our new chief of surgery. The department's been preparing for her arrival for weeks. She has a temporary ID badge," Jenkins stated flatly. "Protocol requires." "I understand protocol, Mr. Jenkins," Maya interjected, her professional composure returning now that someone had confirmed her identity. "But surely common sense should prevail. I've explained who I am, someone has now verified it, and I'm due at an important meeting in," she checked her watch, 7 minutes. Jenkins seemed unimpressed. "I'll still need to escort you to the conference room and get verbal confirmation from Dr. Chen or Dr. Harper." Dr. Patel looked uncomfortable. "I should get to the meeting. It was nice seeing you again, Dr. Richardson." He hurried ahead, leaving Maya once again alone with the security guard. "This is absurd," Maya said quietly. "You're making me late for my first departmental meeting as chief." "Just doing my job, ma'am," Jenkins replied. "If you are the new chief, you should appreciate security protocols being followed." They turned a corner, and Maya could see the conference room at the end of the hall. Several surgeons were filtering in, dressed in scrubs or white coats. The knowledge that she would now have to enter her first meeting as chief with a security escort sent a fresh wave of anger and humiliation through her. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, stopping abruptly and turning to face him. "I am Dr. Maya Richardson. I graduated summa cum laude from the University of Michigan, completed my residency at Mayo Clinic, and until yesterday was the Director of Innovative Cardiothoracic Surgery at Johns Hopkins. I have performed over 3,000 surgeries, published 67 peer-reviewed articles, and wrote the textbook on minimally invasive valve replacement. I am not someone trying to sneak into a restricted area. I am the new chief of surgery at this hospital." Her voice had risen slightly despite her efforts to control it. A small group of nurses paused their conversation to look over. Jenkins remained stoic. "As I said, Dr. Chen can confirm your identity. This wouldn't be happening if I were a white man in a suit," Maya said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Jenkins' face hardened. "That's not fair, ma'am. I'm following protocol with any unverified visitor. This has nothing to do with—" "It has everything to do with it," Maya interrupted, her voice low but intense. "How many other visitors have claimed to be department chiefs with temporary ID badges and knowledge of hospital personnel, only to be treated like potential criminals?" 2 more doctors walked past, glancing curiously at the confrontation. Maya recognized one as Dr. Matheson, the man who had wanted her job. His eyebrows raised slightly at the scene, but he continued into the conference room without acknowledgement. Maya felt her chest tighten. This was exactly what she had feared, starting her tenure with a public confrontation that undermined her authority before she'd even begun. Years of experience had taught her that showing too much emotion would only feed into stereotypes about angry black women, but maintaining her composure while being disrespected was becoming increasingly difficult. "Look," Jenkins said, his tone softening slightly but his stance unwavering. "I have a job to do. Hospital security isn't something we take lightly. If you are who you say you are, why not just cooperate? It'll take 2 minutes to get verification." Maya took a deep breath, weighing her options. She could continue arguing with Jenkins, which would only make her later and potentially create a bigger scene. She could demand to see his supervisor, which would have the same effect. Or she could go along with this humiliating escort and deal with the fallout later. "Fine," she said finally, her voice tight. "Let's go." As they approached the conference room door, Maya could see through the glass that the room was nearly full. Dr. Chen stood at the front, checking his watch with a concerned expression. This was not how she had envisioned making her entrance, escorted by security, late, and flustered rather than confident and commanding. "After you, ma'am," Jenkins said, gesturing toward the door with a formality that felt like mockery. Maya straightened her blazer, lifted her chin, and reached for the door handle. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same resilience that had carried her through every other barrier in her career. But she wouldn't forget this moment, or the man who had caused it. As Maya's hand touched the door handle, it swung open from the inside. Dr. William Chen, a distinguished man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, stood in the doorway. His welcoming smile faltered as he took in the scene, Maya standing rigidly with security guard Jenkins hovering at her side. "Dr. Richardson," he said warmly, extending his hand. "We've been waiting for you. Is everything all right?" Before Maya could respond, Jenkins stepped forward. "Dr. Chen, this woman claims to be the new chief of surgery. She has an unauthorized temporary badge. I was following protocol by escorting her to verify her identity." Dr. Chen's expression shifted from confusion to understanding, and then to barely concealed anger. He looked directly at Jenkins, his typically mild demeanor hardening. "Mr. Jenkins, this is indeed Dr. Maya Richardson, our new chief of surgery. The board announced her appointment weeks ago." His voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. There was an email sent to all hospital staff, including security, with her photograph. Jenkins' posture stiffened. I don't recall seeing that email, sir." By now, conversations inside the conference room had quieted as staff strained to overhear the exchange at the door. Maya was acutely aware of dozens of eyes on her from inside, her new colleagues witnessing her first moments as their leader under these circumstances. "Dr. Richardson is one of the most respected cardiovascular surgeons in the country," Dr. Chen continued, loud enough for those inside to hear clearly. "We're incredibly fortunate to have her joining Westlake. Her temporary badge was arranged by administration until her permanent credentials could be processed this morning." Jenkins' face had reddened, though whether from embarrassment or defensiveness wasn't clear. "I was just following protocol, yes," Dr. Chen interrupted. "But discretion and judgment are also part of your job, Mr. Jenkins. Please check those departmental emails more carefully in the future." He turned back to Maya, his expression softening. "Dr. Richardson, please come in. Everyone is eager to meet you properly." Maya nodded, gathering her composure. She could feel a mixture of emotions, relief at the intervention, lingering humiliation from the confrontation, and determination not to let this incident define her first impression. "Thank you, Dr. Chen," she said, her voice steady. She turned briefly to Jenkins, who now looked uncomfortable. "I understand you were doing your job, Mr. Jenkins. I trust this won't happen again." It was a statement, not a question, spoken with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding operating rooms where lives hung in the balance. Jenkins nodded stiffly. "Of course, Doctor. I apologize for the misunderstanding." Dr. Chen ushered Maya into the conference room, placing a supportive hand briefly on her shoulder. "Security is important," he whispered, "but so is recognizing exceptional talent when it walks through our doors." As the door closed behind them, Maya took a deep breath. The room was filled with surgeons, residents, and administrative staff, all now her responsibility. She could see curiosity and varying degrees of welcome on their faces. The incident with Jenkins had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, but she had spent a lifetime refusing to let others' preconceptions limit her potential. She set her briefcase on the table, removed her presentation materials, and straightened to her full height. The room quieted in anticipation. Whatever had happened in the hallway was now behind her. She had a department to lead, lives to save, and barriers to break down, starting right now. 3 days later, Maya sat in her new office reviewing security protocols for the surgical wing. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows that overlooked the hospital's courtyard, illuminating the diplomas and awards she had just finished hanging on the wall. Her nameplate, Dr. Maya Richardson, Chief of Surgery, gleamed on the desk. The department meeting had gone well despite its awkward beginning. After Dr. Chen's glowing introduction, Maya had delivered her vision for the department with the confidence and precision that had become her trademark. By the end, even Dr. Matheson had grudgingly acknowledged the merit of her proposed changes to their transplant protocols. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, setting aside the security manual. Dr. Harper, the hospital administrator, entered with a folder in hand. Behind him was Thomas Jenkins, looking considerably less commanding than he had in the hallway 3 days earlier. His eyes widened slightly at the transformation of the office, which now clearly belonged to someone of significant authority. "Dr. Richardson," Dr. Harper said warmly, "I hope we're not interrupting. We have that security review you requested." Maya gestured for them to sit. "Not at all. Please, have a seat." Jenkins hesitated before lowering himself into one of the chairs facing her desk. His uniform was crisply pressed, his posture rigid. If she hadn't been the subject of his dismissiveness days earlier, she might have felt sorry for his obvious discomfort. "Mr. Jenkins," she acknowledged with a professional nod. "Dr. Richardson," he replied, his tone carefully respectful now, a stark contrast to their first encounter. Dr. Harper opened the folder. "After the incident, on your first day, I asked Mr. Jenkins to prepare a review of our security protocols regarding visitors and temporary credentials. We want to ensure such misunderstandings don't happen again." "I see," Maya said, folding her hands on the desk. "And what have you found, Mr. Jenkins?" Jenkins cleared his throat. "I've identified several gaps in our visitor processing procedures, Doctor. The primary issue being that temporary badges like the one you were issued aren't sufficiently distinguishable from visitor passes." He slid a document across the desk. "I've outlined recommendations for a redesign of our badge system and improved communication protocols between departments when VIPs or new staff are expected." Maya studied the document, impressed despite herself by its thoroughness. "This is comprehensive. I appreciate the attention to detail. There's also the matter of staff training," Dr. Harper added. "Mr. Jenkins has proposed a quarterly refresher course for all security personnel on proper visitor verification procedures, with emphasis on professional conduct." Maya nodded, turning her attention back to Jenkins. "And the email notifications about new leadership? I understand there was one sent with my photograph and credentials." Jenkins shifted in his seat. "Yes, Doctor. I've also recommended an improved system for high-priority communications. The current email system allows important announcements to get buried in daily updates." He paused, then added with visible effort, "And I want to personally apologize again for my conduct during our first meeting. It was unprofessional and presumptuous." The word hung in the air between them. Both knew what he wasn't explicitly saying, that he had made assumptions based on her race and gender rather than approaching the situation with an open mind. Maya maintained her professional demeanor, but fixed Jenkins with a steady gaze. "Mr. Jenkins, hospital security is indeed critical, particularly in surgical departments where sensitive equipment, powerful medications, and vulnerable patients must be protected. But security isn't just about keeping the wrong people out. It's about ensuring the right people can do their jobs without unnecessary obstacles." Dr. Harper nodded in agreement. "Right. Balance is key. This relates to a broader issue we're addressing," Maya continued. "Westlake has been losing talented staff to competing hospitals, particularly women and people of color. The board has asked me to help create a more inclusive environment as part of raising our national ranking." She gestured to the security report. "These procedural improvements are a good start, but the human element matters just as much as the protocols. When talented professionals don't feel welcomed or respected, they leave, and patients suffer from that loss of expertise." Jenkins met her gaze, a new understanding seeming to dawn on him. Here was this woman he had nearly ejected from the hospital, now calmly explaining how his actions connected to institutional challenges she had been specifically hired to address. The power dynamic had completely reversed. "I understand, Doctor," he said quietly. I've worked here 15 years and take pride in keeping this hospital safe. I never intended to make anyone feel unwelcome. Intentions and impact are different things, Mr. Jenkins, Maya replied. But I appreciate your willingness to improve the system. She handed the report back to him. Implement these changes, and let's meet again in a month to assess their effectiveness. Yes, Doctor, Jenkins said with new respect in his voice. Thank you for the opportunity. After Jenkins and Dr. Harper left her office, Maya remained at her desk, contemplating the interaction. There had been something satisfying about seeing Jenkins squirm under the weight of his mistake, a small measure of justice after the humiliation she'd experienced. Yet she felt conflicted about enjoying that discomfort, even momentarily. As a surgeon, she had learned to separate personal feelings from professional judgment. Emotions had no place in the operating room, where a steady hand and clear mind meant the difference between life and death. She turned to the window, watching staff and visitors move through the courtyard below. 1 month into her tenure at Westlake, she was already making significant changes. The transplant protocol revisions had been unanimously approved. 3 more female surgeons had been hired, including Dr. Aisha Williams, a brilliant trauma specialist who had been overlooked by 4 other hospitals despite her exceptional record. And now, the security protocols were being reformed. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called. The door opened to reveal Jenkins again, this time alone. Dr. Richardson, do you have a moment? He asked, his expression more earnest than she had seen before. Maya gestured to the chair across from her desk. Of course, Mr. Jenkins. He sat, setting a small stack of papers on the edge of her desk. I've drafted the new security directive for your review, as requested. But that's not why I came back. Maya raised an eyebrow, waiting. Jenkins took a deep breath. I wanted to speak with you privately, without Dr. Harper present. He paused, seeming to organize his thoughts. What happened on your first day? It wasn't just about the protocols or missed emails. I made assumptions I shouldn't have made. The admission hung in the air between them. When I saw you in that hallway, he continued, I didn't see a chief of surgery. I didn't even consider it as a possibility. He met her eyes directly. I've been thinking about why that is. Maya leaned forward slightly. And what conclusions have you drawn, Mr. Jenkins? That I've been carrying biases I wasn't fully aware of, he said frankly. 20 years in security, and I've developed certain patterns of thinking about who belongs where. It's not something I'm proud of. Maya nodded slowly. Recognition is the first step toward change, Mr. Jenkins. I've known Dr. Matheson for 15 years, Jenkins continued. When I heard rumors about a new chief coming from Johns Hopkins, I guess I pictured someone who looked like him, or Dr. Chen. He shifted uncomfortably. Not a young black woman. I'm 42, Mr. Jenkins, Maya said with a hint of humor. Hardly young in surgical years. A small smile crossed his face. Fair enough. The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. My daughter is in pre-med at Howard University. She wants to be a surgeon. I've told her all her life that she can be anything with hard work and determination. Then I turn around and treat someone like you, who's achieved exactly what I tell her is possible, as if you don't belong. The personal revelation surprised Maya. She studied Jenkins with new interest, seeing dimensions to the man that hadn't been apparent during their previous encounters. Working security, you develop instincts, Jenkins added. But I'm starting to see that some of what I thought were instincts were just prejudices in disguise. Maya considered her response carefully. There was genuine remorse in his voice, but she had heard apologies before that led nowhere. What mattered were actions, not words. Your daughter, she said finally. What's her name? Kiana, Jenkins replied, a father's pride momentarily overtaking his discomfort. She's brilliant. Top of her class. Medicine needs more brilliant minds, Maya said. Especially in surgery, where women, particularly women of color, remain underrepresented. She paused. Do you know why I agreed to take this position, Mr. Jenkins? He shook his head. Because changing systems requires authority, she explained. I could have stayed at Johns Hopkins performing surgeries and training residents. But here, I have the opportunity to reshape an entire department's culture, to ensure that the next Dr. Richardson doesn't face the same barriers I did. Jenkins nodded slowly. I understand. And I want to be part of that change, not an obstacle to it. He hesitated. My behavior that day, it's exactly the kind of thing that would infuriate me if it happened to Kiana. Maya felt the last of her resentment begin to dissipate. Not because Jenkins deserved immediate forgiveness, but because she recognized the genuine struggle of someone confronting their own biases, the uncomfortable, necessary work of growth. The security proposals are excellent, she said, gesturing to the papers he had brought. I'll review the final draft by the end of the week. Thank you, Doctor. Jenkins rose to leave, then paused. I was wrong that day, and not just about who you were. You were right that it wouldn't have happened if you'd been a white man in a suit. I would have approached the situation differently. That's hard to admit, but it's true. The admission cost him something in pride, but there was relief in his expression too, the unburdening that comes with honesty. Self-awareness is crucial in medicine, Mr. Jenkins, Maya replied. We can't fix what we don't acknowledge. The same applies to institutional problems. He nodded. I'd like to speak to the security team personally about these issues, with your permission. Beyond just the procedural changes. I think that would be valuable, Maya agreed. And perhaps sometime you could bring Kiana by. I'd be happy to talk with her about surgical residency programs. Surprise and gratitude flickered across Jenkins' face. She would be honored, Dr. Richardson. Truly. As he left her office, Maya turned back to the window. The confrontation that had begun in humiliation had transformed into something unexpected, not just professional respect, but the potential for genuine change, both personal and institutional. 6 months later, Maya stood at the podium in Westlake Memorial's Grand Auditorium, addressing the hospital's quarterly all-staff meeting. Under the warm lights, she could see hundreds of faces, doctors, nurses, technicians, administrative staff, and support personnel, all focused on her words. In the front row sat the board of directors, nodding approvingly as she outlined the surgical department's impressive improvements in efficiency, outcomes, and staff retention. And finally, she said, reaching the last slide of her presentation, I'd like to recognize the security department for their outstanding implementation of our new credential and visitor management system. These changes have enhanced hospital safety while creating a more welcoming environment for staff and patients alike. She gestured toward the side of the stage. I'd particularly like to acknowledge Thomas Jenkins, who spearheaded this initiative and has become an unexpected ally in our diversity and inclusion efforts. Jenkins, dressed in his formal security uniform, nodded appreciatively from his position near the stage exit. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of mutual recognition that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. After the meeting concluded, Maya found herself in a quiet corner of the reception hall, taking a moment away from the constant stream of conversations. Dr. Chen approached, 2 glasses of sparkling water in hand. Impressive turnaround in just 6 months, he said, offering her one of the glasses. The board is thrilled. Surgical outcomes up 8%, staff turnover down 12%, and patient satisfaction scores at a 5-year high. Maya accepted the drink with a smile. It's been a team effort. Indeed, Dr. Chen agreed. Though your leadership has been the catalyst. He glanced across the room where Jenkins was deep in conversation with Dr. Williams, the trauma surgeon Maya had recruited. Some transformations have been more surprising than others. Maya followed his gaze. Jenkins has been remarkably receptive to change. He's instituted bias awareness training for his entire department. After that first day, I wouldn't have predicted this outcome, Dr. Chen admitted. I was ready to recommend disciplinary action. Sometimes people just need the opportunity to see their blind spots, Maya replied. Though I won't pretend I wasn't tempted to take you up on that disciplinary action at the time. Dr. Chen chuckled. I've been at Westlake for 30 years, Maya. I've seen administrations come and go, initiatives rise and fall. But what you've managed to accomplish in 6 months. He shook his head admiringly. You're changing the culture here, not just the procedures. Change is slow, she acknowledged. We still have a long way to go. But the direction matters, Dr. Chen said. And you've set the right one. As Dr. Chen was called away by a board member, Maya noticed Jenkins approaching. Dr. Richardson, he greeted her with genuine warmth. Congratulations on the presentation. Thank you, Thomas, she replied, having moved to first-name basis with him in recent weeks. Your security improvements deserve that recognition. He smiled briefly, then his expression grew more serious. I wanted to show you something, if you have a moment. He reached into his inner pocket and removed his phone, bringing up a photograph. Kiana's acceptance letter came yesterday. Maya took the phone, looking at the image of a beaming young woman holding an official letter. Johns Hopkins Surgical Residency Program, she read, genuinely delighted. Thomas, that's wonderful. It's an exceptional program. She told them about the mentorship you've provided over these past months, Jenkins said, his voice thick with emotion. The committee was impressed by her connections with a surgeon of your caliber. Kiana earned that spot through her merit, Maya insisted, handing back the phone. Though I'm happy to have played a small role in her journey. Jenkins pocketed the phone, his expression reflective. When I think about how close I came to throwing you out of this hospital. He shook his head. The irony isn't lost on me that my daughter's future might have been affected by my own bias. Life has a way of bringing things full circle, Maya observed. A comfortable silence settled between them, two people who had moved from antagonists to allies through the difficult, necessary work of confronting prejudice and embracing growth. Dr. Chen mentioned you're implementing a new surgical mentorship program targeting underrepresented students, Jenkins said eventually. Maya nodded. We're partnering with 5 local high schools. Students will shadow surgeons, participate in simplified simulations, and learn about medical career pathways. We're hoping to reach students who might never have considered surgery as an option. Like you once were, Jenkins noted. Exactly, Maya agreed. Though I had my father's encouragement, even if he was a hospital janitor rather than a doctor. Many students don't have anyone in their corner, telling them they belong in these spaces. Jenkins considered this. Would you be open to having security participate? We could add a component about hospital operations, emergency protocols, give them a rounded view of healthcare systems. The suggestion surprised and pleased her. I think that's an excellent idea, Thomas. Let's discuss it further next week. As Jenkins excused himself to return to his duties, Maya took a moment to observe the reception hall. 6 months ago, she had walked into Westlake as an outsider, questioned and challenged despite her credentials. Today, she moved through these same halls with earned authority, implementing changes that would open doors for others. The incident with Jenkins had been painful, but in retrospect, it had also been instructive, a microcosm of the very challenges she'd been hired to address. Real change wasn't just about policies and procedures, it was about people confronting their biases and choosing to grow beyond them. Maya knew the work was far from complete. Prejudice wouldn't disappear overnight, and institutional barriers had deep roots. But as she watched the diverse gathering of healthcare professionals collaborating across departments, she allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. Change was possible. She had seen it firsthand, in this hospital, in Thomas Jenkins, and herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new resistance, new opportunities to falter or advance. But for today, in this moment, she could appreciate how far they had come, and how many doors would be easier to open for those who followed. Sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a single confrontation. Dr. Maya Richardson's journey from being profiled to transforming an entire hospital culture reminds us that true leadership isn't just about titles, it's about creating space for others to grow. Have you ever witnessed someone's prejudice transform into understanding? Share your stories of transformation in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more moments when the tables turn on those who judge too quickly. Remember, assumptions can be broken, stereotypes can be shattered, and respect, once earned, can change institutions forever.